The most disturbing women killers in prison, full list and crimes that shook America. Welcome back to Justice Reversed, where real crimes meet real justice. Number 1, Aileen Carol Wuornos. She was born on a leap day and died in a prison execution chamber. In the 1 year that separated obscurity from infamy, Aileen Wuornos rewrote the image of the American serial killer, not as a shadowy man preying on women, but as a woman with a gun, roaming Florida highways in search of men. Aileen Carol Wuornos, born February 29, 1956, was the product of a childhood filled with abandonment, incest, and abuse. She began engaging in sex work at the age of 11. After being raped and impregnated at 14, she gave up her child and drifted deeper into a life of instability, crime, and addiction. By her early 30s, she was living in a wooded area off Florida highways, surviving off prostitution and petty theft. Between November 1989 and November 1990, she committed a series of murders that would make her name infamous. Her victims were men, 7 in total, ranging from ages 40 to over 60. They included a repair shop owner, a rodeo worker, a truck driver, and even a former Air Force major. Most of them had picked her up while she was working as a prostitute. Wuornos would lure them off the highway, shoot them multiple times with a .22 caliber revolver, rob them, and leave their bodies discarded in wooded ditches or on desolate roads. One victim, Peter Semes, was never found. The pattern repeated itself over and over: seduction, murder, theft, disappearance. Wuornos's actions defied criminal profiling norms. Female serial killers typically poison or suffocate, often targeting people they know. Wuornos shot strangers. She was calculated, armed, and mobile. Her use of a gun, a typically masculine weapon of murder, shocked investigators and challenged public assumptions about female violence. She later claimed she killed in self-defense, saying her clients had tried to rape her, but this defense wavered. She sometimes admitted to lying about the self-defense claims, then reversed herself again. In one case, her first victim, Richard Mallory, had a history of sexual violence, giving some weight to her justification, but that context was absent in the 6 other cases. By January 1992, Wuornos was in custody and facing trial. She was 35 years old. Her mental state quickly became a subject of national interest. Diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and exhibiting symptoms of psychosis, her courtroom behavior was erratic, paranoid, and disturbing. She claimed prison staff were poisoning her food, believed she was being targeted by a conspiracy, and cycled through legal counsel, appeals, and retractions. Psychiatrists noted her delusions, but each time she was declared legally competent to stand trial and make decisions about her case. She was convicted in 6 separate trials and sentenced to death in each. While awaiting execution, she remained on death row at Broward Correctional Institution in Florida, before being transferred to Florida State Prison. In 2001, she waived all her remaining appeals. Despite strong opposition from advocacy groups who argued she was mentally unfit, the court affirmed her competency once again. She was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Her final words were cryptic: "I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, Big Mothership and all." For many, it was a final unsettling reminder of her psychological unraveling. She became the 10th woman executed in the U.S. since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, and only the 2nd in Florida. The legacy of Aileen Wuornos is tangled and unresolved. She was painted in turns as a monster, a martyr, a mentally ill woman destroyed by a lifetime of trauma, and a symbol of how society fails its most broken members. Her story inspired books, documentaries, and the Oscar-winning film Monster. But beyond the headlines and Hollywood scripts remains a more difficult truth. Wuornos's crimes were horrific. But so was the path that led her there, marked by abandonment, violence, mental illness, and desperation. Her life raises uncomfortable questions about justice, gender, and whether society punishes broken people for becoming the very thing it made them. For some, her death was justice served. For others, it was state-sanctioned revenge on someone who had already lost everything long before her first victim did. In the end, Aileen Wuornos was not just a killer. She was a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of survival and forcing America to look back. Number 2, Reta Phyllis Mays. There were decorated veterans who had survived war zones, only to die in hospital beds on American soil. Their killer wore scrubs, not camouflage. She didn't break into their homes, she walked into their rooms, silently, night after night, administering death disguised as care. Reta Phyllis Mays was a 42-year-old nursing assistant at the Lewis A. Johnson Veterans Medical Center in Clarksburg, West Virginia. Trusted by her coworkers and patients alike, she served on the night shift, the quietest hours, when vigilance was at its lowest and trust was absolute. Between July 2017 and June 2018, Mays took advantage of that trust to kill at least 7 elderly veterans by injecting them with lethal doses of insulin. Her victims were not diabetic, and her access to medication was unauthorized. Each victim was a man who had once worn the uniform of the United States military. Archie Edgell, 84, had served in the Korean War. William Holloway, 96, had been part of the greatest generation in World War II. Robert Edge Sr., Felix McDermott, Raymond Golden. Each carried a history of service, of sacrifice. And each died under suspicious circumstances, sudden, catastrophic drops in blood sugar that couldn't be explained. Some, like George Shaw Sr., suffered multiple organ failure as their bodies shut down. Others were discovered to have insulin injection sites on autopsy, evidence of deliberate, concealed harm. For a year, no one suspected the quiet woman in scrubs. She moved easily through the wards, worked overnight, and signed off reports. But the pattern began to surface. Hospital staff noticed a spike in unexplained hypoglycemic events. Investigators found her name on the logs for nearly every suspicious case. And then they searched her internet history. What they found was chilling. Mays had searched 4 female serial killers and watched episodes of nurses who killed, including one focused on insulin overdoses. When questioned, she denied involvement 3 times, before finally admitting what she had done. She confessed that she administered insulin to patients who weren't prescribed it, and that doing so gave her a sense of control. Mays was no stranger to chaos. Before becoming a nursing assistant, she had served in the West Virginia National Guard, deployed to Iraq and Kuwait. She claimed to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and was under psychiatric medication during her time at the VA hospital. Her personal life was also unraveling. Her husband had been convicted of possessing child pornography, and she faced mounting stress both at home and at work. But none of that justified what came next. In July 2020, federal agents arrested her. A year later, she stood before a judge in the United States District Court for the Northern District of West Virginia. She pled guilty to 7 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The court sentenced her to 7 consecutive life terms plus 20 years, ensuring she would never walk free again. The judge called her the monster that no one sees coming. Public reaction to the case was swift and furious. News outlets branded her an angel of death. The Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General uncovered a cascade of institutional failures, lax background checks, poor oversight, and missed warning signs. One of the most shocking revelations was that Mays had previously worked as a corrections officer and had been named in a lawsuit for allegedly beating an inmate. The VA settled civil lawsuits with families of her victims, paying over $5 million in damages. Reta Mays now resides at the Federal Correctional Institution in Aliceville, Alabama. She is ineligible for parole. She will die in prison, just like her victims died in hospital beds they believed were safe. But justice, in this case, cannot bring back what was lost. Her victims lived honorable lives, only to have them ended in the shadows by someone who should have been a guardian. Her story is not just about murder, it's about trust betrayed, systems that failed, and the thin line between compassion and cruelty. In the silence of the night shift, one woman became a judge, executioner, and self-appointed God. And for that, a nation mourns, not just the lives lost, but the innocence lost with them. Number 3, Lisa Jo Chamberlin. They were staying with family, temporarily, casually, just until things settled down. No one expected the visit to end in slaughter. But inside that modest home in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, 2 people were brutally killed, dismembered, and packed into a freezer. And at the center of it all was a woman named Lisa Jo Chamberlin. Born in 1972, Chamberlin had endured a childhood filled with physical and sexual abuse. Her mother suffered from bipolar disorder and alcoholism. Her father and stepfather both inflicted violence. She was assaulted by her half-brother and a schoolteacher. That trauma followed her into adulthood, where she developed a meth addiction and became involved with Roger Gillett, a man she later claimed had total control over her. According to affidavits, Gillett beat her unconscious, choked her, drugged her, and attempted to drown her. Still, on the surface, they were just another couple couch surfing with relatives. But behind that facade was a plan rooted in greed, addiction, and violence. In March 2004, Chamberlin and Gillett moved in with Gillett's cousin, Vernon Hewlett, and Hewlett's girlfriend, Linda Heinzelman. What happened next was not a sudden outburst, it was a calculated double murder, carried out in 2 stages over 2 days. On March 19th, Vernon was attacked with a hammer, had his throat slit, and was later decapitated. Linda's ordeal was worse. She was strangled, stabbed, and left for dead. When the pair returned and found her still alive, they suffocated her with plastic bags. The details came straight from Chamberlin herself, confessions that would later be played in court. The couple didn't stop at murder. They proceeded to dismember the victims' bodies, carefully wrapping limbs and torsos and placing them in a freezer. The freezer was loaded into Vernon's own truck and driven to an abandoned farmhouse in Kansas, where it remained for 9 days. Inside were the remains of 2 people who had once offered them a place to stay. Their downfall came through a stolen vehicle report and a search warrant. Kansas authorities, responding to a tip, discovered the gruesome contents of the freezer. Chamberlin and Gillett were arrested. What followed was a trial filled with disturbing admissions, conflicting motives, and a defense rooted in trauma and control. Chamberlin's taped confession revealed that the motive was likely robbery. They believed a safe in Vernon's house contained valuables. When he refused to open it, they chose murder. She was convicted in July 2006 of 2 counts of capital murder. The Forest County jury found the violence especially heinous, and the court agreed. Chamberlin was sentenced to death, making her the only woman currently on Mississippi's death row. Gillett was also sentenced to death, but in 2018, his sentence was reduced to life without parole. Chamberlin's appeals have continued for nearly 2 decades. Her legal team has cited ineffective counsel, racial bias in jury selection, and claims of coercion by Gillett. At one point, a federal judge granted her a new trial. But the full 5th U.S. Circuit Court reversed that ruling, reinstating her conviction and sentence. In May 2025, the Mississippi Supreme Court rejected her latest appeal. Throughout the appeals process, Chamberlin's defense highlighted her traumatic history and mental illness. Diagnosed with PTSD and borderline personality disorder, she claimed that years of abuse had left her unable to resist Gillett's influence. But the courts were unmoved, noting that her own confessions showed no signs of domination and that she had actively participated in both murders. Her case has fueled public debate, not just because of its shocking details, but because of what it reveals about the death penalty, abuse survivors, and the justice system. It has been featured in crime documentaries like Deadly Women and has become a focal point for discussions around gender, trauma, and accountability. If executed, Chamberlin would be the first woman put to death in Mississippi since 1944. The horror of this case lies not just in the brutality of the crime, but in the complexity of the people involved. Lisa Jo Chamberlin was a victim long before she became a killer. But her choices, cold, deliberate, and devastating, destroyed 2 lives and forever altered countless others. Her story is a grim testament to how trauma, untreated and unchecked, can evolve into something far more terrifying. And it leaves behind a chilling question: how much of our past can we blame for what we choose to do? Number 4, Heather Pressdee. They thought they were in safe hands, frail patients in nursing homes, looked after by a trained professional. What they couldn't have known was that the woman caring for them had a secret pattern. Over the course of a year, Heather Pressdee turned her medical knowledge into a method of slow, calculated murder. Born in 1982, Heather Irene Pressdee was 40 years old when she began killing her patients. A licensed nurse moving between care facilities in Pennsylvania, she was entrusted with the most vulnerable, elderly, and disabled residents who depended entirely on her for their basic survival. But from 2022 to 2023, Pressdee exploited that trust in the most lethal way possible by injecting patients with insulin, many of whom weren't even diabetic. Her known victims ranged in age from 43 to 104. Among those she killed were 90-year-old Gerald Schramm and 55-year-old James Bartow. Nicholas Symbol, 43, who was blind and cognitively impaired, was also among her victims. She pleaded guilty to 3 murders but was tied to at least 17 deaths and 19 attempted killings across 5 nursing homes. The method was quiet, bloodless, and devastatingly effective. Some patients suffered prolonged, agonizing declines as their blood sugar plummeted. Others died quickly, with no chance for medical intervention. Many of the victims never knew what had happened to them, and some family members only found out months after their loved ones were buried. The premeditation was undeniable. Pressdee didn't just inject patients, she manipulated shift schedules to ensure they would die before the next nurse arrived. She administered the overdoses shortly before her shift ended, reducing the risk that the insulin's effects would be traced back to her. She knew the medical system well enough to avoid triggering internal alarms. Her text messages, later uncovered by investigators, were just as disturbing. "Can I kill this man at Taco Bell?" she wrote in one. In another, "I drugged him already and don't know how he's still awake." These weren't confessions of panic or regret, they were casual statements from someone fully aware of what she was doing. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office described her as a predator who used her position of trust as a means to poison patients who depended on her for care. Her co-workers had raised red flags before. At multiple facilities, she was written up or let go for unprofessional behavior, abusive language, and cruelty toward patients. In some cases, she was accused of preventing nonverbal residents from receiving food or water. Yet, each time, she was able to secure new employment at a different facility. In May 2024, Heather Pressdee pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and 19 counts of attempted murder. The plea deal spared her the death penalty, but the consequences were no less severe: 3 consecutive life sentences and hundreds of additional years behind bars. Families filled the courtroom for her sentencing, where she offered no defense, only the words, "because I am guilty." She now resides at SCI Muncie, a women's correctional facility in Pennsylvania. No appeals have been filed. Her plea effectively ended the legal process, but the public reckoning had just begun. The case sparked outrage and disbelief, not just because of the horror of the crimes, but because of how easily they occurred. It exposed major flaws in the oversight of long-term care facilities, particularly in how complaints and disciplinary actions are tracked or, more accurately, ignored. The healthcare system is built on a fragile promise that caregivers will do no harm. Pressdee shattered that promise. Her crimes were not a moment of weakness or desperation, they were choices made over and over again, each one more deliberate than the last. And in doing so, she joined the ranks of healthcare killers whose betrayal of trust leaves wounds deeper than any physical injury. What happened in those nursing homes is more than a tragedy. It's a reminder that trust must be earned, monitored, and enforced, not assumed. For the families of those who died, justice may have been served. But the real question lingers: how many more Heather Pressdee are out there, hiding behind a uniform, waiting for their moment in the dark? Number 5. Amber McLaughlin. She knew the exact time her ex would walk out of work. She had stalked her before, violated a restraining order, and even broken into her home. But this time, she came armed. Under cover of night in suburban Missouri, Amber McLaughlin waited silently until Beverly Gunter stepped outside, into a trap she wouldn't survive. Amber McLaughlin, born Scott A. McLaughlin on January 13, 1973, was 30 years old at the time of the crime. Beverly Gunter, 45, was her former girlfriend. Their relationship had ended months earlier, and Gunter had taken every precaution, filing police reports, obtaining protective orders. But on November 20, 2003, none of that could save her. When Gunter left work that night, McLaughlin ambushed her in the parking lot. She raped her, stabbed her repeatedly with a steak knife, and left her body near the banks of the Mississippi River in St. Louis. The crime scene was marked by blood and a broken knife handle. McLaughlin's obsession had escalated steadily in the weeks leading up to the murder. Despite legal restraints, she continued tracking Gunter's movements. This was no spontaneous outburst, it was planned. Prosecutors later emphasized the cruelty of the act and the prolonged fear Gunter had endured. McLaughlin was arrested shortly after the body was discovered. In 2006, a Missouri jury found McLaughlin guilty of first-degree murder, rape, and armed criminal action. But when it came time to decide the punishment, the jury deadlocked on whether she should receive the death penalty. Under Missouri law, one of only 2 states that allow it, a judge can impose a death sentence when a jury cannot reach a unanimous decision. The judge sentenced McLaughlin to death. Legal appeals followed. In 2016, a federal judge vacated the death sentence, ruling that McLaughlin's defense had failed to present critical mitigating evidence. That included her history of mental illness, brain damage, and severe childhood abuse. But in 2021, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit reversed the decision and reinstated the death sentence. Over the course of her years on death row, McLaughlin transitioned and began identifying as a woman. While her legal documents continued to bear the name Scott A. McLaughlin, she lived as Amber. This fact would later become central in public discourse as her execution approached. As her January 2023 execution date neared, McLaughlin's attorneys filed a clemency petition to Missouri Governor Mike Parson. It detailed her traumatic upbringing, placed in foster care, abused by multiple guardians, exposed to stun guns and humiliation, and diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome and borderline intellectual disability. She had also attempted suicide multiple times throughout her life and was later diagnosed with gender dysphoria. The petition argued that these factors, ignored at trial, should weigh against her execution. The petition drew national attention. LGBTQ+ organizations and anti-death penalty advocates protested outside the prison in Bonne Terre, calling the execution a misuse of judicial power. Critics highlighted that Missouri's law allowing judges to impose a death sentence over a deadlocked jury verdict was ethically and legally troubling. Despite the outcry, Governor Parson denied the request. On January 3, 2023, Amber McLaughlin was executed by lethal injection at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic, and Correctional Center. She was 49. Her final written statement read, "I am sorry for what I did. I am a loving and caring person." Her execution was unprecedented. She became the first openly transgender person to be executed in the United States. But beyond that historical label was a case steeped in layers of tragedy, a brutal murder, a flawed legal process, and a life marked by untreated trauma and pain. McLaughlin's case raises questions that still hang in the air. Should a judge be allowed to impose death when a jury cannot agree? Should childhood abuse and mental illness weigh more heavily in sentencing? And how do we reconcile justice for a violent crime with mercy for a life shaped by violence? For Beverly Gunther's family, closure may have come with the final chapter. For others, the story of Amber McLaughlin is far from over. It remains a mirror reflecting the sharp tension between accountability and compassion, between law and humanity, and between the sentence imposed and the story untold. Number 6. Judith Neelley. She wasn't old enough to drink, but she was already orchestrating kidnappings, torture, and murder. At just 18 years old, Judith and Neelley lured children and young women into a brutal scheme of violence, acts that would brand her one of the youngest women ever sentenced to death in American history. Judith and Adams Neelley was born in 1964 and married Alvin Neelley, a man 10 years her senior, when she was just 15. Together, they became a criminal couple traveling across the southeastern United States, robbing, abducting, and eventually murdering. Their most notorious crime began on September 25, 1982, when they spotted 13-year-old Lisa Ann Milliken at a Georgia mall. She was a resident of a group home for neglected and abused children. Judith lured her into a car, offering friendship. What followed was a multi-day ordeal of unimaginable cruelty. Held captive in a motel room in Scottsboro, Alabama, Lisa was repeatedly raped by both Judith and Alvin. Judith then attempted to kill her by injecting household drain cleaner, Drano, into her neck, arms, and buttocks. When the chemicals failed to end Lisa's life, Judith beat her with a slapjack and then shot her in the back, execution style. She threw Lisa's body over a cliff into Little River Canyon, where it was discovered days later. Just a week later, the Neelleys struck again. They abducted Janice Chapman and her fiancé, John Hancock, from a Rome, Georgia street. Judith shot Hancock, who survived. Janice was not so lucky. She was tortured and shot multiple times before Judith left her for dead. Prosecutors later described the pattern as part of a twisted scheme. Judith would lure young women and girls so Alvin could sexually abuse them. The couple used CB radios to communicate while scouting for victims. Judith was arrested shortly after Lisa's body was found. Her trial for capital murder began on March 7, 1983, in Fort Payne, Alabama. Evidence presented at trial shocked the courtroom. Forensic testimony confirmed Lisa's torture. The state argued that Judith's actions were premeditated and uniquely cruel. The jury convicted her of capital murder during a kidnapping. Despite their recommendation for life without parole, 10 jurors voted life, 2 voted death. Judge Randall Cole overrode their decision and sentenced her to death, citing the heinous, atrocious, and cruel nature of her crimes. Judith's defense argued that she had been brainwashed by her husband. Her childhood had been marked by trauma. Her alcoholic father died in a motorcycle crash when she was 9. A psychologist testified that Judith suffered from battered woman syndrome and was under Alvin's complete control. But the prosecution presented a starkly different picture. Judith was no passive participant. She orchestrated the abductions. She injected the poison. She pulled the trigger. In 1989, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld her conviction. She remained on death row at Alabama's Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women. But in a dramatic twist, just days before her scheduled execution in January 1999, Governor Fob James commuted her sentence to life imprisonment. Citing the jury's original recommendation, James's decision drew national criticism, especially from law enforcement and the families of the victims. The commutation made Judith eligible for parole in 15 years. In response, Alabama lawmakers passed a bill in 2003 specifically banning her release, but that law was later ruled unconstitutional. Her parole hearings in 2018 and 2023 reignited public outrage. Family members of her victims, prosecutors, and even Governor Kay Ivey spoke out forcefully against her release, calling her a monster and urging that her crimes never be forgotten. Judith remains incarcerated, with her next parole hearing scheduled for 2028. She is classified as a Category 22 killer, considered among the most evil by forensic experts, due to her role in torture-based serial crimes. Her case continues to be studied as a prime example of judicial override, psychological manipulation, and the darkest forms of premeditated violence. In the decades since, the story of Judith and Neelley has served as a haunting reminder that evil is not always born of age or strength. Sometimes, it wears the face of a teenager, smiles with false warmth, and extends a hand not to help but to destroy. And for the families of her victims, justice may be permanent but peace remains forever elusive. Number 7. Brenda Andrew. She said it was a robbery. She claimed masked intruders had burst into her garage and gunned down her estranged husband while he helped light the furnace. But investigators quickly noticed the inconsistencies, and what began as a domestic tragedy soon unraveled into one of Oklahoma's most controversial capital murder cases. Brenda Andrew, 39 years old at the time, was navigating a bitter divorce and custody battle when her husband, Robert Rob Andrew, was found shot to death on November 20, 2001. He had come to the house they once shared at Brenda's request, supposedly to help fix the heater. But the encounter ended with 2 shotgun blasts, one to his chest, another to his arm. Brenda herself sustained only a superficial wound to her arm, raising immediate suspicion. What unfolded next shocked even seasoned prosecutors. They alleged Brenda had conspired with her lover, James Pavitt, a former life insurance salesman turned pastor, to kill Rob for an $800,000 life insurance payout. According to their theory, the plan had been months in the making. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Rob had reportedly cut brake lines on his car and expressed fear that Brenda might try to harm him. On the day of the murder, they said, Brenda lured Rob into the garage while Pavitt lay in wait with a shotgun. The case quickly drew national attention, not only for its violent nature, but for the image painted of Brenda during her 2004 trial. Prosecutors emphasized her affairs, the lingerie she packed when fleeing the country with Pavitt, and her failure to act like a proper grieving widow. Her thong underwear was paraded in front of the jury. They called her a slut puppy, argued she was a bad mother, and suggested that her perceived immorality made her more capable of murder. The jury found Brenda guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. On July 15, 2004, they voted for the death penalty. Formal sentencing was handed down on September 22, making Brenda the only woman on Oklahoma's death row. She was incarcerated at the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center, awaiting execution. Yet from the beginning, questions lingered about the fairness of her trial. Brenda consistently maintained her innocence, stating that she had no involvement and that her conviction was an egregious miscarriage of justice. Pavitt himself confessed to shooting Rob and claimed Brenda had no knowledge of the plan. Her defenders argued that the state's case relied more on character assassination than concrete evidence. Appeals followed. Her conviction was upheld in state court and later in federal court by the 10th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. But in January 2025, a major development shifted the case. The U.S. Supreme Court reversed the lower court's decision, ruling that it had failed to consider whether the prosecution's use of irrelevant, prejudicial, gendered evidence had deprived Brenda of a fair trial. The justices did not overturn her conviction, but they ordered the 10th Circuit to reassess whether the trial had been fundamentally unfair. The decision was celebrated by human rights advocates. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights had previously warned that executing Brenda would pose a serious and urgent risk of irreparable harm. The Equal Justice Initiative and Cornell's Death Penalty Worldwide project highlighted her case as a stark example of sex shaming in the courtroom, arguing that prosecutors weaponized stereotypes against women who deviate from traditional roles. Meanwhile, public opinion remains sharply divided. To some, Brenda is a manipulative killer who plotted her husband's death and deserves the sentence she received. To others, she is a symbol of how the justice system can punish women not for what they did, but for how they lived. Her execution, once scheduled for December 2004, has been indefinitely delayed. With the Supreme Court's ruling, there is now a path, however narrow, for Brenda Andrew to receive a new trial or a reduced sentence. Her fate lies in the hands of the courts once more. What remains is a cautionary tale about how character can eclipse evidence and how courtroom theatrics can override due process. In a system designed to deliver justice blind to gender or bias, Brenda Andrew's case reminds us just how easily those ideals can be compromised. And in the ultimate question of life and death, that compromise should never be acceptable. Number 8. Monica Sementilli. She opened the front door and left it unlocked. She knew exactly what would happen next. Inside, her husband prepared for an ordinary afternoon. By the time their daughter came home, the garage floor was soaked in blood, and the man they called father was gone. Murder had arrived from within the house. Monica Sementilli was 45 years old when she orchestrated the killing of her husband, Fabio Sementilli, in their upscale Woodland Hills home on January 23, 2017. A respected hairstylist with a global reputation, Fabio had built a life of success and family. He and Monica were nearing their 20th wedding anniversary, raising 2 daughters together. But behind the image of domestic stability, Monica had begun plotting a murder, driven by greed and an affair. Prosecutors would later call her the mastermind behind a brutal conspiracy to collect a $1.6 million life insurance payout. She had been romantically involved with Robert Louis Baker, a former adult film actor and convicted sex offender. Baker, along with accomplice Christopher Austin, executed the killing. Fabio was ambushed in his garage, stabbed 7 times in the neck, chest, and thigh. The wounds severed his carotid and femoral arteries. He never had a chance. Los Angeles County Superior Court Judge Ronald S. Cohen described it as a well-thought-out slaughter. Monica left the door open, prosecutors said, to ensure Baker and Austin could enter without resistance. According to testimony, she made sure the attack would coincide with her daughter's return home, forcing the teenager to discover her father's mutilated body. The betrayal ran so deep, one of Fabio's sisters told the court, it felt as if Monica had timed the murder for maximum cruelty. In 2025, after nearly 8 years of legal proceedings, Monica stood trial in Los Angeles County. The jury, 10 men and 2 women, deliberated for less than 9 hours. They found her guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Both special circumstance allegations, murder for financial gain and lying in wait, were upheld. These elements enabled the court to impose the harshest sentence allowed under California law, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, Monica maintained her innocence. Her defense team argued she was not involved in the murder and cited co-defendant Robert Baker's testimony that he alone was responsible. Baker, who also received life without parole, claimed Monica had nothing to do with the planning or execution. Monica's daughters, Jessica and Isabella, spoke in her defense, declaring their belief in her innocence and pleading for reconsideration. But Judge Cohen was unmoved. He rejected the defense's request for a reduced sentence, stating that Monica had orchestrated the entire event and was the prime mover in the execution of a human being. He dismissed Baker's testimony as self-serving and inconsistent with the totality of the evidence. Even if he had the discretion to reduce the sentence, Cohen said plainly, "I would not." The case drew wide media attention. Fabio's professional profile and the affair with a porn actor gave the story national visibility. But it was the emotional testimonies, from grieving sisters to daughters torn between love and disbelief, that gave the case its haunting resonance. The image of a mother accused of setting up her children's father to be butchered in their own home proved unforgettable. Despite the verdict, Monica's family remains committed to pursuing justice as they see it. Her daughters expressed hope for a successful appeal. "We hope that true justice will prevail," Jessica said in court, "and our mother will come home to us." As of now, Monica remains incarcerated in a California state prison, serving a life sentence with no parole eligibility. The Sementilli case poses unsettling questions. How does a marriage degrade into a murder plot? Can love for a parent coexist with belief in the other parent's innocence? And when wealth, betrayal, and death intersect, how do we separate truth from loyalty, guilt from denial? Ultimately, the tragedy of Fabio Sementilli lies not just in how he died, but in who helped make it happen. The court has spoken. The wounds, physical and emotional, will remain for a lifetime. In the end, justice may be served, but peace, for those left behind, is still a distant hope. Number 9. Genene Jones. She was supposed to save lives. Instead, babies stopped breathing during her shifts, one after another, in hospital after hospital. Genene Jones wore a nurse's uniform, but her actions betrayed the very oath of care she was trusted to uphold. Behind her smile was a pattern of lethal control. Born in 1950, Genene Jones worked as a licensed vocational nurse in Texas throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. She appeared competent and caring, working in pediatric units where children were most vulnerable. But under her care, young patients repeatedly experienced sudden and unexplained medical crises. And far too often, they died. In 1984, Genene Jones was convicted for the murder of 15-month-old Chelsea McLaughlin, a toddler she injected with the drug succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant that paralyzes the body and stops the heart. She received a 99-year sentence for that crime, and an additional 60 years for injuring another child, Rolando Santos. But Chelsea and Rolando were not the only victims. Jones's name had long been associated with a string of suspicious deaths and near-death episodes among infants during her hospital shifts. At one clinic, a bottle of succinylcholine, accessible only to Jones and a single physician, was discovered to be 5/6 saline. It had 2 puncture marks in the rubber top. The implication was chilling. Someone had been tampering with the drug to conceal unauthorized use. In court and in the press, prosecutors argued that Jones had been injecting infants with toxic substances to manufacture emergencies. Some believe she did this to gain praise as the nurse who saved dying children. Others speculated that she hoped to justify the creation of a pediatric intensive care unit in Kerrville, Texas. Whatever the motive, the results were fatal. More than a dozen children are suspected to have died or been harmed due to her interventions, though only a few cases resulted in formal charges. Joshua Sawyer was one of them. Just 11 months old, he died in December 1981 after Jones gave him a massive dose of Dilantin, an anti-seizure medication. The toxic levels led to cardiac arrest. For decades, no charges were filed in his case until 2017, when Jones, then 66, was indicted for his murder as part of a renewed effort to keep her from being released early under a defunct Texas law. That law, active between 1977 and 1987, allowed for the automatic release of inmates based on time served and good behavior credits. Without intervention, Genene Jones would have walked free in May 2018. To prevent her release, the Bexar County District Attorney filed 5 new murder indictments between May and June 2017. In 2020, Jones pleaded guilty to the murder of Joshua Sawyer as part of a plea bargain. She was sentenced to life in prison, ensuring that she would likely never leave custody again. Prosecutors dropped 4 other charges in exchange, but the impact of her crimes was already cemented in public memory. Jones had always maintained her innocence, at least until her final plea. But over the years, reports emerged of disturbing admissions. "I really did kill those babies," she allegedly told a parole officer in 1998. In 2011, she tearfully told a prison review panel, "I was not a sane person. I did inject the little girl." And yet, during her trial, her defense claimed she had been misunderstood, perhaps even maligned. The case ignited fierce public outrage. Victim families and advocacy groups campaigned to keep her behind bars, with many labeling her one of America's most insidious healthcare serial killers. The loophole in Texas's mandatory release law, allowing violent offenders to walk free based on time served, was brought into sharp focus, prompting broader scrutiny of parole laws and the justice system's handling of institutional crimes. Today, Genene Jones is imprisoned in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, serving a life sentence. She is not eligible for parole until she is 87 years old, and there is no possibility of early release under her latest conviction. No organizations have sought clemency. No public voices have advocated for her release. Her story remains a cautionary tale of the unchecked power granted to those in positions of care, of the devastating consequences of systemic oversight failures, and of the enduring pain inflicted on families who never received a chance to say goodbye. In the end, Genene Jones's legacy is not one of healing, but of harm concealed behind a hospital badge. And it serves as a grim reminder that not all monsters hide in shadows. Some walk fluorescent-lit hallways, wear scrubs, and cradle lives in their hands, only to let them slip away, one by one. Number 10. Susan Lorincz. She believed the conflict had ended once police were called. But as dusk fell that June in 2023, Susan Louise Lorincz made a choice that would forever shatter two families. Standing behind her locked front door in Marion County, Florida, she pulled out a .380 handgun and fired a single, fatal shot through the metal frame, ending the life of her neighbor, 35-year-old Jack A.J. Owens. At 60 years old, Susan was no stranger to trauma. She and Owens had clashed repeatedly over the years, at least 6 calls to police between them since early 2021. A dispute that day began when Susan shouted at AJ's children, even striking one with a pair of roller skates. AJ came to confront her neighbor. Susan, already angered, retreated inside and dialed 911 as police were en route. But instead of waiting, she fetched a weapon from another room, returned to the door, and fired. The bullet pierced the chest of a mother of 4, aged 4 to 13. AJ collapsed before bedroom walls lined with family photos. The judge later described the shooting as completely unnecessary, noting that Susan was behind a locked door, in a position of safety, and that her decision to use lethal force was driven more by anger than fear. Susan was charged with first-degree felony manslaughter. At her August 2024 trial, prosecutors emphasized how she did not face imminent danger, yet chose to retrieve a larger-caliber weapon and fire through her door at a neighbor, not a stranger. They highlighted that AJ was clearly not a burglar, rapist, or attacker, but a concerned mother confronting noise and incivility. Still, Susan's defense painted another picture. They underscored her lifelong struggle with chronic PTSD, rooted in a childhood of profound abuse. From the age of 4, she and her sister endured physical and sexual violence from their father. At 9, she was sexually assaulted by a landlord. Her brother was also abusive. Doctors testified that these traumas, compounded over decades, had left Susan significantly impaired in her ability to appreciate the criminality of her actions that day. A defense psychologist testified that Susan's PTSD symptoms, intense reactions to screaming and conflict, undermined her control and judgment. Yet the jury, composed of residents familiar with their suburban community, found otherwise. They concluded Susan's act was voluntary and unjustifiable, convicting her in August of 2024. On November 25, 2024, Judge Robert Hodges sentenced Susan to 25 years in prison, the maximum allowable. He acknowledged her trauma, lack of criminal record, and the mitigating impact of her PTSD diagnosis. But he emphasized the gravity of AJ's death, the devastation inflicted upon her 4 young children, and the extent of harm to the Owens family. The judge stated that while her mental health merited consideration, it was ultimately overshadowed by this tremendous harm inflicted and the aggravated nature of the crime. Susan remains in state custody, with her defense having already requested a public defender to initiate an appeal. Though the direct application of Florida's Stand Your Ground law was dismissed early on, indeed, the sheriff's office declined it after noting Susan was safely behind a locked door. The case reopened broader debate. Could she have feared for her safety? Or was this yet another tragedy born from unresolved psychological wounds? The killing also ignited discussion about race and community tension. A.J. Owens was black, and Susan, who reportedly shouted at the children, becomes part of a larger conversation on how minor neighbor disputes can escalate into deadly encounters. A.J.'s mother, Pamela Diaz, spoke before sentencing. This killing of a mother, a daughter, a friend, should have never happened. With Susan now removed from her community, Diaz felt a measure of closure. We got justice today, and now we can forge ahead on the journey of healing. But the story remains complex. Susan's life was shaped by unspeakable childhood violence, her actions by mental illness. AJ's life cut short, her children left parentless. Justice, then, feels partial, swift, but stark. It carries no answer to how a neighbor's home devolved into a scene of irreversible loss. Susan's case challenges us to ask, where do boundaries between self-defense and preemptive violence lie? Can trauma justify fear-driven choices? And when does anger become an action for which society must hold us accountable? In quiet towns across the nation, neighborly conflict is routine. But when armed anger crosses the threshold of a locked door, it marks a pivotal question: how well do we understand the broken souls behind sudden violence? And what collective responsibility do we bear when personal history metastasizes into tragedy? In a country where fewer than 60 women have ever been executed, each case we've explored today tells more than just a story of crime. It reveals the deepest fractures in our justice system, our culture, and our understanding of evil. But this list is far from complete. Who's next? Who has a date with death, and who might escape it? And what dark truths still lie buried behind prison walls? Subscribe to Justice Reversed and hit the bell icon, because the next chapter is already unfolding, and you'll want to be the first to know. These aren't just names on a list. These are lives, verdicts, and legacies that continue to shake America to its core. Stay with us. The story isn't over yet.